Hello, this presentation is a part of Aalto University's webinar series on research data management and open science. And today we will cover the topic of personal data anonymization, which, as you can guess already from how it's written there, it's difficult to do anonymization. It's sometimes even difficult to do pseudonymization. And maybe the most generic term is personal data minimization. I'm Enrico Glerian, staff scientist and data agent from the Aalto University School of Science. So the outline for this short lecture is first understanding why anonymization is important. And here we will mix kind of the perspective of ethics, of law, and also open science. Then we will cover some of the definitions related to the kind of different levels of anonymization, pseudonymization, minimization, and also understand anonymization through re-identification examples. Then we will cover the practical part. How can we actually do and work with anonymization before data collection or after the data has been collected? And finally, some comments on workflows when anonymization is not possible, and other issues that might be related to anonymization and open science. The learning outcomes from this lecture is you will be able to understand why anonymization is important and why you want to spend precious time doing that. Furthermore, it's important that you understand what are the possibilities and the limitations of the current techniques for anonymization, minimization, and also understand the legal and ethical issues related to anonymization. Here are some references. You will receive a link to the slides, and in general, the slides are full of other links to many other resources. I won't comment much on this, but depending on if you need to go deeper on the topic, please visit this, at least the references mentioned here. All right, so let's start with why are we here? Why is this important? What we will cover are the so-called privacy enhancing technology, PETs. And so the context is the context of privacy, data protection, and research ethics. As always, ethics is not law. In the ideal world, law and ethics would completely overlap, but in practice, there might be things that are ethical to do, even though might be illegal, and other things that are not illegal, but they might be unethical. Now, if you include science in this intersection, you understand that there are different perspectives and different challenges according to these three domains. The space where we want to work, of course, is the overlap that we can be ethical towards our subject, towards society, towards the environment, respecting the national law, on in Europe, the European laws, but also making sure that we can be ethical towards science and other scientists, being transparent, being able to share our data, our findings openly. The kind of background between these three things, these three kind of dimension aspects, when it comes to ethics, the history is quite long, especially in Europe. It all started kind of with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And you see from the quotes there, I will not go through all the quotes, that the concept of privacy in the sense of, personal privacy, personal space has been one of the main human rights. And it's nice to see that from these principles of human rights, the law emerged. And in specific case, if we move to the law section, in the European context, we talk about the General Data Protection Regulation. So many of, the good thing of living in Europe is that many laws and many legislation at the European level in Europe are coming from this Declaration of Human Rights and other documents that have outlined the human rights. This is ethics and law in the topics of privacy, but then we also need to follow, when we do research, we also need to follow the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity. And specifically, here one of the 4 principles of this ALEA code of conduct is honesty. And honesty comes with transparency. So you're basically seeing from what I'm saying here that there is a sort of conundrum or kind of a tension between what the privacy, which is the ethics part, the right of individuals to control access to and the use of their personal information, the legal part, which is the data protection. There are all the rules and regulation and practices that are basically governing the collection and processing and storage of personal data. So on one hand, we would like to have data secrecy and keep things as secure and secret as possible. But on the other hand, when it comes to science, we also want to have data transparency. We want to follow the principles of the ALEA code of conduct and be honest and transparent, share the data with other scientists in the community, and in general make the data reusable and sustainable. Of course, this, it's not a black or white situation, is a continuum. And what are we covering here are some of the techniques and some of the tools that can be used to ensure the ethics, the privacy, the law, the data protection, and also the research integrity, the transparency. So you see tools like the informed consent or ethical review boards. They make sure that privacy is taken into account. And then the data protection with the recommendation, the privacy by design or data minimization, data sharing agreements, access control. So through the use of these ethical tools and legal tools, we can basically, most of the cases, reach a level of data transparency that is in line with the principles of the ALEA Code of Conduct. So when it comes to the minimization and anonymization, it's good to start with some concepts and definitions. The context here is the context of research data with human participants. Most of the things that I will say here, of course, they also apply in other contexts of research data, for example, in companies or hospital, other things, but the focus here is academic research. In general, as I already mentioned, the context in this specific case is the European context. So we will follow the General Data Protection Regulation. And if one looks at the definition of personal data in the GDPR, personal data is any data about a living people from which they can be identified. If you collect information from or of persons, consider it as personal data. Other countries like United States, they have a less strict regulation or what are these personal data, what are personal identifiers. But in general, there is the so-called Brussels effect that Europe tends to be a little bit closer to human rights, a little bit more strict when it comes to these issues related to living people. And then the kind of the decisions and the laws that are defined in Europe, they tend to affect the rest of the world. When it comes to personal data, there is no taxonomy where one could identify different types of data, but I'm going to use the one that the FSD, the National Finnish Social Science Archive, is using. And specifically, there are 3 types of identifiers or personal data items. There are the direct identifiers, which means that this is information that on its own, it's enough to identify an individual. Think, for example, at your social security number or your name and surname or the exact date of birth. So these are direct identifier. If I find something and in this thing that I find, it clearly says that it's somebody's property with name and surname and address, there is a clear identifier. Then there's this second type of identifiers. There are indirect identifier and specifically strong indirect identifier. So this is information that maybe there is, just by looking at the information, just by reading for example, the phone number or the vehicle registration number of a car, I'm not able to immediately tell who is associated, which person is associated to this number. But then there are registry that one can look up easily who's the owner of a specific phone number or who's the owner of a car. And so that these are considered strong indirect identifier because it's fairly easy to re-identify, obtain a name and a surname and the identity of from this type of information. And then the last one are the indirect identifiers. So indirect identifiers are information that maybe if you collect only the indirect identifier on its own, maybe it's not enough to identify someone. But when you start to combine many indirect identifiers, let's say that you start asking someone, what's your nationality and in which postcode do you live and what's your age and how many children do you have and all these things, the more information you start adding, the more you're actually building a fingerprint. So that at the end, maybe not always, but in some cases, you're actually able to re-identify, to uniquely identify a person. So when it goes to the definition of this type of techniques, I'm going to now cover all the terms that are used: minimization, pseudonymization, anonymization. The first term, minimization, is actually the one used in the GDPR. And the concept of minimization is that we want to work with the minimum amount of personal data that is necessary to accomplish the task. In this specific case, research. So that with the following the principle of minimization, we don't want to collect personal data just because, maybe one day might be useful. We should define what are our needs, what type of personal data we need, and then anything that is not needed can be removed. And this is the minimization. So it's clear that with minimization, there's still personal data. We just remove that part of the personal data that we might not need directly for our purpose, but we're still dealing with the personal data. There are, in general, something to remember that this is sometimes confusing. There's no issue in collecting personal data if you have a clear purpose for doing that, if you have the documentation that you clearly show how you're planning to collect the data and to use the data, and this type of documentation is called privacy notice, then you can basically collect any type of personal data. There's some extra care needed when you collect the so-called special categories of personal data. And if you are at Aalto University, we have legal experts that can help you identify these cases and sometimes recommending the ethical review process. Then the more we go away from the direct identifiers, from minimization, and a little bit more secure than minimization is pseudonymization. So the idea is now is not just removing what we don't need, but sometimes we can also replace, we might still need, for example, an identifier. Let's say that you're planning to collect data from an individual today and you want to re-interview the same person in 1 year. So of course you still need to, keep the identity of the data, but anyway, with the data that you might be working, you can replace some of the identifier with pseudonyms or codes or other things like that. So the idea is that we make it difficult for others to re-identify, so that if you have this interview or spreadsheet that just says, I don't know, subject 15, nobody else would know who is subject 15, but you, if you have the key and you still have the key, you are able to basically re-identify who is subject 15. This is often done in many studies. So the example I gave here is for longitudinal studies, but also in medical data. Sometimes you want to work, when you're working with the data, you don't need the direct identifier anymore, but it is possible using external information, meaning using an external key to re-identify, for example, if you are running a medical study and have some incidental findings, you're still able to contact the original patient, the original subject. There is another term that is sometimes used and it's called de-identification. This is not a good term of use in the European context. De-identification is sometimes used in the United States. And kind of the meaning is removal of direct identifiers. So it's kind of similar to the case of pseudonymization. And in practice with the GDPR, we still call this type of data pseudonymized. The slight difference here is that at this stage, we don't have the key anymore. So we throw away also the key, but there is always a way, or there is often a way to re-identify somebody. I give you an example. If I take a picture of my fingerprint and make sure that it's just a picture, there's not my name and surname or other things attached. If I just show you this picture, you wouldn't be able to say, okay, that's Enrico's finger. But whoever somewhere, not maybe in a source that is close to you, accessible to you, but somewhere else in this country or in Italy, in my case, they might store another fingerprint of my finger with the name and surname and social security number attached. So then the key exists somewhere else, and there is a way to re-identify. As we will see later, of course, one has to also consider what is the amount of effort to do this type of re-identification. Another example that I often get asked in my work with brain images is that when we work with the magnetic resonance images, we take a picture, or better, a volume of the whole brain, but because of being in the head, we also get a 3D picture of the face. And that face is, you can, from the MRI image, you can see you can basically see the face. So for minimizing the data in a brain scan, sometimes the face part is basically masked out, but it's still possible to re-identify somebody, because if you have another brain scan from the same individual, it's like the story of the fingerprint. You're still able to tell, who was the owner of this specific defaced brain scan. And finally, the more away we are from personal data is when data becomes anonymized. And here, anonymizing personal data means to irreversibly remove identifying information. It is basically mathematically impossible to go back to associate some person to the anonymous data that you have. It's important, again, to say that to notice that in the GDPR, there's this mention of this reasonably likely, because of course, with the technology of today, we can claim that some data is being truly anonymized, but we're not able to assess if, with large computational efforts or with new technologies that we don't know, maybe one day this data is not anonymous anymore. What is nice, though, is that in the moment that you have anonymous data and you can actually, how can I say, prove, mathematically show that the data is anonymous, then the GDPR does not apply anymore. And so this data, because GDPR does not apply anymore, could be, for example, openly shared or used for any other purposes that basically do not require to be in contact with the original data subject. However, one should also think about the ethics, and this is something that I will cover at the end. One can also look at if we now want to summarize what I just told you about, we can think of some sort of a spectrum, the data minimization spectrum. So in this figure, for the very left side, this is the case where you have personal data full of direct identifiers, the name, the surname, whatever social security number of your individual. So it's clear now, if you have this type of data, it's very easy to re-identify who is the subject, who is the data subject associated to that personal data. Then with pseudonymization, so we start our minimization path, we can, for example, replace strong identifiers with some hashes or tokens or other ways. So what we have here is now that there is a way to re-identify the data subject if we wanted, because we still have a key. There is still maybe, some piece of paper stored in a secure place that would still re-identify that subject 15 is this and that person. With masking, so where we want to basically suppress strong identifiers, in this case, we might even throw away the key. So the key is lost, but maybe there is other data that is not in our hand, or maybe there will be future data. And with this other data, reusing this other data, maybe it's reasonably likely to re-identify this individual. And then you can see that the more we move from the left to the right, the more we go to the fully anonymous cases. Now we have the first case of anonymization with techniques like K-anonymity, L-diversity, and T-closeness. And I will talk about K-anonymity. The others are in the references. So here it becomes mathematically impossible to re-identify a person. So that there are these techniques are basically making sure that if you try to re-identify somebody, there will always be some level of uncertainty. That, for example, there will be 5 individuals in your data that have exactly the same variables, that have exactly the same background values, and it's impossible to tell who was who. So this is now mathematically impossible to re-identify someone, but this data is still related to an individual. So even though GDPR is not going to apply anymore, one could argue that maybe ethics might still apply, that maybe this data should still follow what you promised to your subject if you collected the data, for example, through informed consent. But these are, of course, considerations that we can leave for the end. And then finally, we have the last case of anonymization, where the difference compared to the previous case is where now the data is not related to an individual anymore. So not only it's impossible to re-identify somebody, it's also that now this data doesn't come from someone. So one way of doing this is aggregation, that, for example, you do an average of 5 or more people. Let's say that for each household, for each apartment building, you don't want to store all the age of all the people living in the building. You just store the average. And then for each department building, you just have a number that is the average of those living there. So this is not a data that relates to an individual. And in this sense, it's truly anonymous and it doesn't relate to an individual. Another technique is data synthesis, where, for example, you can resynthesize some background variables from your subject. But the idea of data synthesis is that they are generated in a way that they don't relate to a single individual anymore. So, for example, you collected 100 subjects and you know their distribution, let's say the distribution of their age. Then you can synthesize, 1,000 subjects so that the distribution of their age is still the same, but now they're not individuals. They're not data points that are related to individuals. All right. So in this other section, I'm going to give you some examples of re-identification to better understand anonymization. So in this silly example, let's pretend that we are in a small village in Lapland with 300 individuals living there. So sometimes we run a questionnaire, we want to collect some background data, and we might ask in our questionnaire, what's your age range? In this case, it's decades. So that people can say, are you in your 20s? Are you in your 40s? Are you in your 50s? And stuff like that. So you see here with this histogram that for each of this decade, for each age range, there's some number of individuals. So for example, in their 40s, there's about 45 individuals. The problem, of course, is that there are some rare people in this small village. It's only 300 individuals. And only one person actually answered in the range of 100, 110 years old. So, there is actually only a single individual who is older than 100 years old. And most likely everyone knows in the village who is this person that is older than 100 years old. Of course, at the same time, sometimes when we collect background variables and questionnaires, we might also ask for sensitive information if that is our our research topic. So now you see that this 100-year-old person that most likely everybody knows in the village, now with this type of data, one would also know that there's some sensitive history related to this person. Sometimes maybe getting this age range is not enough. Maybe one could argue I truly need to know the exact number of years. So then we could increase kind of the granularity of our data. And instead of asking just for age range, now we want to ask for the exact age. And you see here that yes, for some ages, there's still more than one individual that share the same birth year. But it starts to be that, for example, some other people that there's just one of them in the data set. So the more we start increasing kind of the sensitivity, the granularity of our data, the more we start singling out individuals. And then we can go to the very detailed level. And in this case now, we not only are asking for the age, we are also asking, for example, for the exact hour and minute and second when someone was born. And in this specific village, everyone was born in a very different minute and second and time, that there are no people born exactly on the same second. So now with this level of granularity, it's so increased that now we have created a fingerprint for each individual in this village. This type of data is called having a K anonymity of 1, which means that there is one identifier, which is the exact date of birth, including also the time of birth down to the seconds, so that given this date and time, we can uniquely identify anyone in this small village. So now, if instead in our generalization, this is the type of method, if we would say that actually we want to make sure that we want to have a K anonymity of 70, then we can create new bin ranges for this village, so that now anyone between who is older than 60, they can just say I'm older than 60 without specifying if they're born, if they are 70 something, 80 something or more. So in practice, what I'm trying to explain you with this silly example is that K-anonymity is that each person contained in the data cannot be distinguished from at least K minus 1 person. So now here, because there are 70 or a bit more than 70 individuals between who are age 60 or more, then we can say that the risk of re-identify somebody in this range is impossible. So now that the data with this type of K anonymization is truly anonymous. So in practice, what we're doing here is the so-called singling out. And you can understand with the more data you have, the lower becomes this level of K anonymity. So if you ever play with the game Guess Who, with Guess Who, often with 4 questions, you can basically uniquely identify your players. And the same is with any personal data. The more questions you start asking for your subject, the more you're creating like a fingerprint. There is a nice paper from 2019 where they basically looked at these so-called demographic variables, what is normally asked in these census questionnaires. And then they demonstrated that with just 15 pieces of background information, you can uniquely identify more than 99% of the American population. The type of information that they were asked are, for example, the date of birth, gender, zip code, and then you have other information here. Already with these 3 pieces of information, kind of like the 80% was re-identified. And the more you were starting adding some information, depending on the information you were asking, you could easily reach, basically full re-identification success. So here I'm talking about re-identification for fingerprinting. You can understand that we were now discussing background variables and things that we can ask from individuals and build a fingerprint from individuals. But when you start collecting even more rich data, and it usually means data related to their body, fingerprints, DNA, eye movements, brain activity. There's in practice anything that relates to the human body. Then anonymization starts to become impossible unless you really destroy the data, unless you really, want to make the data unusable. However, data minimization is still necessary. So we can still work with this type of DNA, fingerprints, brain images, and so on. But we want to also minimize the data so that if we don't need to store the identity, the name and surname and other details from an individual, from the data subject, all that can be removed so that one can only focus on the personal data that is needed for research purposes. Another example here, when it comes to anonymity, when you start collecting more numbers, more variables per subject, the anonymity start to become more challenging. This is a visual example to give you an idea what happens when for each subject, which is these dots that you see here in this figure, we collect two variables. For example, let's say the age and their income. So that, the people in this corner here would be people who are the oldest people in the data set and very rich. And here below you have someone who is junior, young, and with a low income. So then the principle of anonymity that we saw earlier, we could, for example, separate that. So this top half, these are the high income group, and here the low income group. But then we would still have their detailed, this would be we said age. This would be the older ones, the high age, and this would be the lower, the younger people. And then, of course, we could also kind of being separate, so this would be the young with low income, young with high income, old with high income, and old with low income, and so on. We can basically repeat this process. So this is similar what we did earlier with the single variable, but you can understand that the more variables you start adding, the more such process becomes impossible. Another thing important to remember is that re-identification that some malicious agents, they also do the so-called re-identification attacks, and there are risks associated. So in practice, there are different type of attacks. Some very famous one is, for example, where Netflix released an open data set on how people were, basically the activity of people with Netflix. But then there was another open data set, which was the activity of the users of the Internet Movie Database, how they were rating the movies. And so it was possible to see basically in the Internet Movie Database, some users, they had certain movies that they reviewed, and it was possible to link them to some Netflix users who were basically watching those movies. So this was a bit of a privacy scandal when it happened a few years ago, because two datasets that were supposed to be anonymous or anonymous enough, it was actually possible to link them and basically extract new information. There are other types of attacks, like the model extraction attacks related to AI, and I will talk about those with more details in a few minutes. And in general, another thing to remember that sometimes you want to study a rare population, whether it's a rare disease or a minority. And so you can understand that in those cases, there are higher chances for the participants to be re-identified. These are the kind of risks that you want to discuss with your legal experts and ethics expert, so that you can understand, how to work with it. But again, it's not impossible. There are many studies done on professional musicians, celebrities, politicians, and or people with very rare diseases. All right, briefly, I'm gonna cover now some of the challenges posed by artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence, without going into the very details, there are various tools and various ways of using artificial intelligence. But what we often deal with artificial intelligence is that we have a model. The AI model, is basically a collection of data that it's basically the data that this artificial intelligence machine learning system was exposed to but it's stored in a way that is not just a database of all the data that was exposed, but it's basically stored in the patterns. So some of these AI tools are tools, for example, that you can type some text and generate an image for a text. The model that we're looking here is a tool called Stable Diffusion. And so in this recent paper, some researchers were basically able to prompt to make so that Stable Diffusion model was able to regenerate some of the images that were used in the training set. So this doesn't mean that all the images that were used for training this AI model are actually stored into the model, but few images, maybe because they were more rare or they had something more specific, they're actually basically, as you can see here, they were stored with almost a one-to-one definition. So you can understand that this type of, for example, AI images models, they could have a privacy risk, because if this image model would be related to, I don't know, the storing of medical images, it would be possible for some patients, not for all of them, to re-extract the original images that were used for training the model. Some other examples that with other advances in machine learning technology. So in this paper here, they basically have again a generative AI, so a technology that is able to synthesize images in this case, where the input now is not text like we had earlier, but the input is a blurred image. So that basically this technology was trained in a sense, give me a very blurry image and I will make it, I will increase the kind of the quality of the image, something like, we've been seeing in some TV series. That for example, this tiny image, 8x8 pixel, can become a 32 image. So of course you can see that it's not exactly identical to the ground truth. So the generated synthesized image is not, of course, identical to the original, to the actual one, but one could argue that it can get close enough, because from this original image here, it was kind of very hard, if not impossible, for a human to say that it might be someone like this, but you can already see that actually the AI was able to resynthesize something that, it's like, in this case, it was able to synthesize that it was a man, kind of with some facial details that are very similar to the ground truth image. Another example of resynthesis of images, closer to what I was mentioning earlier with the brain images and defacing, is that, for example, this on top is the original image, and then the image, as I mentioned earlier, is defaced. So this is the masking technique. So the actual face, the nose, the eyes, and the mouth, they are completely removed. But this generative AI technology, after seeing many, many images, is basically able to resynthesize the nose or other organs that were basically removed. Again, it's not exactly the same person because it's a synthesis. So there is some noise, there is some variation, but at the end of the day, it's just a matter of getting more data and more kind of, increasing the number of parameters that, in theory, one could actually resynthesize even when the data is completely missing. This is another example here, a bit older paper. In this specific case, they were mapping the speech. So the basically the sound, the recording of the voice, and synthesizing faces from the speech. So the principle is again the same, that first the model has been trained so that given certain voices, also the faces were given. And then the model was used to generate, given some voice, is then basically transforming the voice into picture of a face. Once again, it's not, the synthesized face is not exactly the same as the original face, but you can understand anyway that some kind of details are preserved. So for example, one can argue that, maybe the age of the synthesized face is close to the age of the original face, or the ethnicity in other cases. So you can understand that this kind of maybe guessing game that we would do if we just hear a voice and we would need to guess, is it a man, is it a woman, is it young, is it old? Now it's not a guessing game anymore, because the technology, the artificial intelligence, is actually able to do this even with a higher reliability than us playing this guessing game. Another hot topic when it comes to artificial intelligence is digital surveillance and remote biometric identification. So specifically, the advances in machine learning technology, they allow today for fast digital surveillance in various conditions. This basically means that you can have a crappy CCTV image from someone walking on the street, and there are now techniques that make it very, very easy to re-identify the person from the low quality CCTV camera with maybe a database of people with their identity. So this is often called remote biometric identification, and it's currently a very hot topic as part of the European Parliament's AI Act, the Artificial Intelligence Act. This is truly something that they are discussing in the past 10 days. Some people are arguing that remote biometric identification should be completely banned, so that in Europe it should not be possible to do this type of re-identification using AI. But others advocate that maybe it is actually useful for some critical cases. For example, in cases that are related to crimes that would, go to jail for more than 5 years. The issue, of course, is that if it will be part of the AI Act, if remote biometric identification is kind of approved in Europe, they would still need to store anyone's kind of data, personal data, in the event of re-identifying a potential criminal. So it's a difficult challenge. In general, if you're interested in this topic, I recommend also searching for the so-called mosaic effect, where multiple datasets linked with each other can use to reveal new information, sometimes even dangerous information. There are other concepts related to data minimization, data anonymization that you might encounter when you go to the references. And in general, many references will talk about microdata, which is the data related to one individual. So when we have one data point per individual, and then aggregation that I briefly covered earlier. If you are more interested on these topics, there are links in this slide where you can go deeper into this type of concepts. So now for some practical part. Anonymization can happen before data collection or after data collection. Before data collection, it's often called privacy by design. The idea is that one can plan the research, in this case, with minimization in mind, so that one can think, what is the minimum amount of personal data that I need to answer my research question? And everything could be justified in a data protocol and other things, so that only the minimum amount of data is collected immediately at the data collection stage. The data management plan is a good moment to start this. And of course, one can also realize if there are ethical aspects, not just legal aspects, because sometimes maybe you might be collecting data related to health in the broadest sense, and you might end up with some incidental findings. So if the type of data you collect could be associated with incidental findings could be that you, for example, scan a brain for some cognitive neuroscience, but when you put the person in the scanner, you realize that from the image, you're able to see that there's something very strange with their brain, like a tumor or a cyst. So then in this case, it's important actually to know the identity of the data subject that you are collecting, because then you can pass it to a medical doctor, and so that there is a process for dealing with these incidental findings. Sometimes, however, very often we, of course, collect also background data. And even in the background data, like in the case that I showed you earlier, one can restrict as much as possible the range of answer. So you can understand that if you have a questionnaire with the open-ended answer, there is a higher chance that someone might start saying names of other people or mentioning their own name. And in practice, you might end up with personal data, even though it was not in your plan. If instead the range of answer is restricted as much as possible, like we were showing earlier, that if instead of specifying the exact age, one can only pick a very large age range, then there are higher chances that the data are going to be fully anonymous. In general, you do not want to promise that the data will be fully anonymous, unless you have the mathematical proof, unless you do some simulation before data collection where you can truly show that it's impossible to re-identify somebody. In doubt, it's better to, even though your data collection is as anonymous, as minimal as possible, it doesn't hurt to anyway mention that you are collecting personal data, that there are chances of collecting personal data, provide a privacy notice compliant with the GDPR, and then if there are rare instances where someone maybe wrote their name or some personal data, you can maybe discard those participants. Then there is anonymization after data collection, which means that very often it's impossible to collect data that is immediately in anonymized form. However, we're still able to do minimization after. And this is the example that I was saying earlier. For example, with health data, we can remove the direct identifiers or the faces from the MRIs. Here in this table, there are some examples given the type of identifier. What would be the anonymization method? So for example, this personal identification number, we want to completely remove it. But maybe, if one mentions their part of a town, one can categorize it so that you have that there are enough participants for a certain part of a city, rather than having one single participant in a specific part, and so on. There's a nice collection of links here for doing various of these data minimization and even anonymization, tabular data, MRI faces, text, the so-called NER, name entity recognition. So I want to spend a little bit more few minutes on anonymization in qualitative research, because it's often very challenging in qualitative methods. It's a difficult balance that on one hand, you want to have data as rich as possible to use your qualitative methods. But then on the other hand, you also don't want to deal with sensitive data or personal data, or in general, other data that is not truly related to your research questions. So in general, there are good principles to follow for minimizing data. Often these are interview data. Interview data are often converted to text, and that's a good way of minimizing the data. If you don't need the actual speech anymore, if you don't need the video, the face moving, because you're not planning to analyze the face movement, then actually you can convert immediately the audiovisual recording into text only and delete the audiovisual recording. So already this minimization is a good strategy. And then in general, one can then go through the transcript, through the text data, and could start replacing, for example, person names with aliases, or categorizing proper nouns, or maybe removing some sensitive information, or in general other personal data that is not related to the category of interest. So for example, let's say that you care about some experience of your people that you interview, but you don't really care about if they talk about their mother or their sister or their best friend. So you can just replace mother, sister, and best friend with closed person. But maybe in some other study, you really need to know that they're talking about their mother or their sister or their best friend, so that there is not a general rule here that one can apply to all the studies blindly. depending on the context, one should basically decide which data can be minimized and which data should possibly be stay there. Again, artificial intelligence and machine learning allow for not truly automated, but at least helping the researcher with this type of approaches. This technique is called name entity recognition. And for example, what it can do is highlight for you those personal name and surname or cities or whatever you specify to the name entity recognition. It is a quite good technique, but again, it never reaches the 100% anonymization, full anonymization, which means that at the end of the day, you always need to quality control your data. So here, yeah, this a little bit more related to what I was saying about name entity recognition. And in general, there are different tools, different machine learning tools that have been trained for name entity recognition to a specific field. So that, for example, a medical NER system would focus on medical terms and those type of documents. Instead, maybe a legal NER system would be more suited for this type of legal documents, for example. In general, name entity recognition, there are many online services, and one could even be tempted to using these large language models for doing that, like ChatGPT. Large language models are useful for doing name entity recognition. They can do a great task with it, but then you also need to remember of the data protection, that sometimes, if not always, you are not allowed to put the personal data of your research subject into remote systems where you are not sure where actually the data is going. So you shouldn't basically copy and paste the interviews to ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT to anonymize those interviews, because you are basically giving that interview data, which might contain personal sensitive data, to OpenAI. There are options to run these machine learning models locally, meaning that they can run on your machine or on a local machine without sending the data outside of the Aalto network in this specific case. These are not easy to use or to set up, but it's possible. So you can always get in touch with contacting us at researchdata@aalto.fi. Well, this we have already covered. I leave these slides for those who are more interested in qualitative research. And another section, we are coming to an end, is the workflows when anonymization is not possible anymore. So sometimes anonymization is not possible anymore, and this relates to different types of workflows that you need to follow when data is not possible, it's not truly anonymous, meaning that you can't just move it to any device. So familiarize yourself with the classification of information of your organization. Usually there are 4 levels of classification of information. And depending on the level, usually research data containing personal data is considered confidential if you obtain the informed consent. But sometimes you might need to call it secret if, for example, you are reusing data that was collected for different purposes, like medical purposes. Then those system labeled for secret use should actually be the one. And in general, you don't want to take the data close to you. You want to leave the data in some secure remote system at your university, for example, and then bring the analysis code or whatever analysis method closer to the data. This is kind of, in a schematic sense, this is, for example, one of the situations where we might have multiple hospitals that contain medical records, and we don't want to take the medical records out of the hospital and run them locally to minimize the risk. It might be actually more convenient and less risky to bring the code, so to bring the machine learning technology to run at the hospital 1, hospital 2, and hospital 3, and then at the end just looking at aggregated findings. There are other access control models, data access control. This is an example picture from the European Genome Phenome Archive. And so in practice, when data anonymization is not possible, there are still approaches where you can open the personal data and get other people to access the personal data, but they need some sort of contracts, agreements between, in this case, we see the data access committee and the requester. Once they get approved and they take responsibility of some of the risk, they can maybe access the full, not anonymous personal data. Confidential computing, where encrypted containers on secure cluster is another solution. Differential privacy, I put a nice link for all interested in differential privacy, which is another advanced technique for keeping the data structure, but making it anonymous. And then in general, data synthesis is a good way to work. And there's this nice digital twin tool that could help you with the tabular data. We are now done with this lecture part. To conclude, some reflections and take-home messages. So in general, the best way to understand data minimization is think about your own data. So try to always remember what are the digital traces of your personal data, the cookies that you leave around the internet when you browse websites, or the GPS traces or other apps that you use. Sometimes even the files that you send around, they will contain your personal data as hidden metadata. So it's not just what you see in a file, there might be other information that you're not aware. You should also always remember where the data are stored. It matters a lot. And, having this fixation of having the data stored in Europe is not just something that came to the mind of the European lawmakers. It actually relates to the fact that in other countries, specifically in the United States, there are other legislation that they allow, for example, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, so that the government of the United States is allowed to access any data that is stored in the United States. They don't need to ask you anything about it. From the moment that you start knowing your rights, or even better, your digital rights, then you understand that you want to adopt the same principles for your data subjects and for making your research data secure. When it comes to opening and sharing the data, we mentioned that transparency is an important principle, but then again, we should always follow that as open as possible, as close as necessary. In some cases, if the data is too sensitive, if there are ethical risks for the data subjects, maybe one should not open that data. GDPR can set restrictions on the secondary view of personal data, but it's also important to be somewhat flexible. Like in the example that I said earlier, sometimes external researchers or peer reviewers might get granted access, limited access for a few days or weeks for the purposes of verifying the integrity of your data and of your research. In general, anonymized data are not personal data. So yes, you can fully share once you are able to mathematically anonymize the data. The GDPR does not apply anymore. However, one should also consider the ethical implications. Maybe you promise to your subject that you will never put the data anywhere. Well, then maybe that promise should also be there also if the data would be anonymous. And there is always the risk that maybe, yes, that data is truly anonymous today, but maybe in few years in the future, it's possible to link it with another data set, or there will be some advanced technologies that will make it possible to re-identify. The other issue with anonymous data fully open is that the data might be used for purposes that were not intended. So, for example, they might be scraped and used to train the next generation of some large language models. Maybe this is not something that your original subject wanted. So then again, even though anonymization gets rid of the GDPR limitations, it still had some ethical implications that maybe even anonymous data from individuals should still be, protected. So in general, when it comes instead to pseudonymized data, so basically personal data, fully opening of personal data is not possible. And again, it always depends on what you have promised to the subject. Sharing with partner institution can be done, but it always requires legal documents. The European Data Protection Board is still discussing on the issues related to the so-called broad consent. Broad consent is something that is currently not possible with the GDPR. And the idea of broad consent is that you join a study where they collect your personal data for a specific purpose, but you would also like that others could reuse the same data for other purposes that are not related to the original one. This is a tricky situation. In some cases, it has been solved for medical data. In Finland, for example, through the Toisiolaki, but this is still a controversial situation. We're still waiting for the European Data Protection Board to give a final answer on this. However, access on request, like the solution that I showed earlier by the European Genome Archive, or the Finnish solution from CSC, Sensitive Data Submit, those are solutions that can be used for opening or better sharing personal data on request. Finally, efforts for opening personal data or sharing personal data, they require lots of people from the ethical, legal, technical experts, IT infrastructure people. So even though we want to open as much as possible the personal data that we use in our study, sometimes one should do data appraisal. That maybe it might be actually cheaper to tell others what was your protocol, data collection protocol, so that others could repeat and collect data that is very similar to the one you actually collected, rather than starting a gigantic effort on this ethically opening of personal data. And finally, data protection in the European context. One might also argue that it's very strict, and some people maybe even think that it's impossible to work with personal data in Europe. There are examples, borderline unethical in my opinion, where people went to other countries in the global south, for example, in Africa, to collect loads and loads of personal data for machine learning purposes, for example. Is this the way to work, or is the European Parliament, European Union way to working better? I don't have the answer for this, but hopefully you got enough for thinking. So to sum up, few take-home messages. You can collect any personal data you need for your research, but take care of the data protection according to the risks. Have the highest standard of ethics and law towards your subjects. If possible, fully anonymize your data. If it's not possible, minimize it. Share the data on request is fine, but you need to make sure that this is possible on the very beginning, before the actual data collection. And when possible, of course, talk about these issues with your data subject, with the study participants. Make them comfortable. Don't leave them alone with consent forms and privacy notices, but explain to them what are the benefits of opening their data and reusing it for future studies. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.